Are you ready for a book review about a book that could possibly change your entire life? Well, check this out. Jason Fung has become a sort of superstar in the diabetes realm. He has almost single-handedly set many thousands of diabetics to begin practicing something we now know as intermittent fasting. Some of his YouTube videos have over 1 million views, some of them a couple of million. In the world of diabetes and YouTube, he is a really, really big deal. I ordered his book, The Diabetes Code, a while back, and on this video, and probably the next one that I'll post, I'll share some of his thoughts and words about reversing and curing type 2 diabetes. It's important that I say type 2 diabetes because he's almost exclusively talking to type 2 diabetics. Type 1 diabetics are almost an entirely different breed. They have special needs and they live in an entirely different situation from type 2s. To start with, let me say that having watched a number of Jason Fung's videos and read his book, The Diabetes Code, I like and respect this man. I think he makes a lot of sense and says some very important things that type 2 diabetics really need to hear. Now, at the heart of every novel and every action movie, there must somewhere be a villain, a bad guy. Without a villain, the book or the movie is bland and dull. And in Dr. Fung's approach to diabetes reversal, there is a bad guy, but it's not the bad guy you might suppose. It's not really high blood sugar, but rather high insulin. Let me give you a couple of quotes from the beginning of the book. First, from the foreword, written by Nina Teichels, she writes this: "The groundbreaking idea Dr. Fung presents in these pages is that diabetes is caused by our body's insulin response to chronic overconsumption of carbohydrates, and that the best and most natural way to reverse the disease is to reduce consumption of those carbohydrates." And then a few pages later, in his opening remarks, Dr. Fung writes, "At its very core, type 2 diabetes can be understood as a disease caused by too much insulin, which our bodies secrete when we eat too much sugar. We must lower our insulin levels by reducing our dietary intake of sugar and refined carbohydrates." Now, these two statements pretty much say it all. All the rest of the book is in explaining and demonstrating the truth of this simple premise, that when we eat too many carbs and sugars, our insulin levels take off and eventually we pay the price of insulin resistance and raging type 2 diabetes. Now, there are a lot of other good points he makes, so don't just assume that now that you've heard these two statements, you don't need to buy the book. But they sum up all that is at the heart of Dr. Fung's beliefs and philosophy about the cause and the cure of type 2 diabetes. Later in the book, he gives a 4-part cycle and recipe for metabolic disaster, which looks like this. Number 1, hyperinsulinemia causes fatty liver. 2, fatty liver causes insulin resistance. 3, insulin resistance leads to compensatory hyperinsulinemia. And 4, repeat cycle. I find this fascinating. You know, when I first discovered I had major blood issues, and that was a long time ago, I was concerned only about lowering my blood sugar. I never gave any thought to my insulin levels. Of course, the reason why I did myself a huge favor was that since I was not taking insulin and simply cutting my carbs and sugars, when my blood sugar levels came down, my insulin levels came down as well. But Dr. Fung's perspective could mean bad news for the diabetic who, rather than slash the carbs in their diet, simply injects himself with more and more insulin. You may get your blood sugar levels down, but taking all that insulin can still spell major problems, which is exactly what some of the studies mentioned in this book demonstrate. Dr. Fung talks about 2 different toxic situations. One is high blood sugar levels, and the other is high insulin levels. And both of these, in his mind, are incredibly dangerous to our bodies, our hearts, our eyes, and many of our internal organs. Another example of a person who may have problems is the diabetic who goes to a high-carb, low-fat diet, maybe a vegan diet. Even if they succeed in getting their blood sugar levels down, the huge number of carbs in their diet may be causing their insulin levels to be sky high, which in itself can be terribly devastating to the body. If you feel you've helped your diabetes with a high-carb, low-fat diet, you might be wise to have your insulin levels checked and see if they're in a dangerous range. Dr. Fung loves to use illustrations, as most good teachers do, and he uses the illustration of a packed suitcase to demonstrate what is happening with insulin resistance. Imagine that you've packed a suitcase as full as possible, jamming and cramming it with shirts, pants, underwear, socks, and all sorts of other items. You can barely close the suitcase. But then you remember you have a dozen other shirts you need to put in that suitcase. You grab the shirts and attempt to stuff them in that already full suitcase. But no matter how hard you push, you can't do very much. Maybe by straining and pushing, you may be able to get a couple more shirts to fit in the suitcase, but it is impossible to fit an additional 12 shirts in that already full suitcase. And that's Dr. Fung's way of showing us the nature of insulin resistance. As a result of a high-carb, high-sugar diet, our cells become filled with sugar, crammed to the max. Then, when we eat another high-carb meal and our insulin tries to escort the resulting sugar in our blood into our body's cells, there's simply no room for any more sugar. And so the sugar remains in our blood and eventually goes into our urine. This is insulin resistance. This is type 2 diabetes. The problem for most type 2 diabetics is not normally that our pancreas is not doing its job. Often it should get a medal for how hard it's trying to pump out enough insulin to do that job. But as long as our cells are saturated with sugar, they're going to resist any more sugar going in. And so our pancreas dumps out still more and more insulin, which is totally ineffective. Meanwhile, we're going through our days with incredibly high insulin levels, which are making us more and more insulin resistant. And even with all that insulin, our blood sugar levels are getting higher and higher. In the 1980s, the so-called experts were telling us that the reason we were getting more heart attacks and seeing increasing diabetes was that we were eating too much meat. We were told we should cut our meat consumption and increase our carb consumption. And that is precisely what many people did. This started around 1980, but it really hit its stride in the 90s. The result was an epidemic of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and high blood pressure. Jason Fung notes that diabetes around the world has quadrupled since 1980. Let me say that again, quadrupled since 1980. He writes, "The link between natural saturated fat and heart disease has been proven false. While artificially saturated fats, such as trans fats, are universally accepted as toxic, the same does not hold true for naturally occurring fats found in meat and dairy products, such as butter, cream, and cheese, foods that have been a part of the human diet for time beyond memory." The 1980 dietary guidelines spawned the infamous food pyramid in all its counterfactual glory. Without any scientific evidence, the formerly fattening carbohydrate was reborn as a healthy whole grain. The foods that formed the base of the pyramid, foods we were told to eat every single day, included breads, pastas, and potatoes. These were the precise foods we had previously avoided in order to stay thin. They're also the precise foods that provoke the greatest rise in blood glucose and insulin. Dr. Fung talks a lot about obesity. In fact, his first book was called The Obesity Code, and he sees diabetes and obesity linked together both in their cause and in their cure. The same high levels of insulin that cause diabetes will also cause obesity. Nothing creates the perfect storm for fat storage like high insulin. So the idea is this: you eat a lot of carbs, your insulin levels are constantly high, which causes you to gain weight and store fat. And the more obese you become, the more likely you are to become diabetic and insulin resistant. Conversely, if you cut the carbs in your diet, your insulin levels go down, as well as your blood sugar. Less insulin in the blood means less fat storage, and you lose weight, as well as seeing an almost immediate drop in your blood sugar. Fung quotes researchers as demonstrating that an 11 to 17 pound weight gain increases your risk of diabetes by 90%. But a weight gain in the range of 17 to 24 pounds increases your risk of diabetes by a whopping 270%. And according to him, the problem is not really the pounds that you're carrying. It's all the carbs you're ingesting that are creating and maintaining that excess weight. He likes to speak about how when obese people have their stomachs stapled to the point where they cannot eat more than a tiny amount of food at a time, they usually immediately cease being diabetic, even though at first their weight hasn't come down to normal. They're still big, but because they can't eat much, they're no longer diabetic. Throughout the book, Dr. Fung is extremely opposed to sugar in all its varieties, and he's not particularly fond of fruit, which of course has a lot of natural sugar. He writes, "My best advice is to avoid eating excessive amounts of fruit, especially as many modern varieties are now available year-round and have been bred to be sweeter than in the past. Dried fruits are usually high in sugar, so you're probably best to avoid raisins, dried cranberries, fruit leathers, and the like." Well, I have to agree. I've learned from my own blood sugar meter that I have to go real easy on fruit. I'll sometimes have half an apple with peanut butter at lunch, but only if I'm not having any other significant source of carbs. And I'll have a clementine at some meals since they only have about 8 net grams of carbs and yet still provide a lot of vitamin C. And of course, many of the berries are fairly low in carbs and low glycemic, especially strawberries, which works out good for me because I love strawberries. When I found out they had only about 1 gram of carbs per strawberry, I was ecstatic. Well, there's a lot more I could say about this book, and in fact, I plan to do a Part 2 book review for next week, in which we'll look at his trademark recommendation, which is intermittent fasting. Dr. Jason Fung is sort of the father of intermittent fasting, as far as I can tell, and he really pushes it strongly for type 2 diabetics. So we'll take a look at some of what he has to say in this book next week. For now, let me sum up by saying I like the book, and I like Jason Fung. There may be a few instances where he oversimplifies things, but all in all, he has a lot of good things to say, and he's a very sharp guy. And his book is an easy read. He makes things pretty simple, which is always a good thing. When I was a kid in school, we sometimes had to do an oral book report where we would stand up in front of the class and talk about a book we had read. It was kind of hokey, and I didn't really like to do it, but our teachers seemed to take pleasure in having us do these oral book reports. We always had to tell whether we recommended the book, and if so, who would we recommend it to. We'd usually say something like, "And I would recommend this book to all my friends." Well, that's about what I would say about Dr. Fung's book, The Diabetes Code. I'd recommend it to all my YouTube friends and subscribers. I think you'll learn a few things, and you'll be inspired to stay with the kind of diet that will bring those blood sugar levels down and the insulin levels as well, in a hurry. You can, of course, get the book on Amazon, and I'll put a link to it down in the description notes. And if you're an Amazon Prime member, you can have the book at your house in a couple of days, at least if you're in the U.S. If you do buy the book, or if you already have it, leave a comment below and let us know what you thought of it. And don't forget to type in Dr. Jason Fung in the YouTube search box and watch some of his videos. In some of his talks, the video quality is not the greatest, and he could use a lighting guy, but what he has to say makes it worth your while, even if you have to watch a dark video. Well, that'll do it for now. Be sure and watch for my next video where we'll look at Dr. Fung's views on intermittent fasting. If you like this video, be sure and give it a thumbs up so YouTube will rank it higher in its search engine and more people will be able to see it. And consider subscribing to this Beat Diabetes channel and then clicking on the little bell icon. That will ensure that you're notified every time we post a new video. God bless, and see you in the next video.